Evening descended slowly over the lower city of Rien, like a sullied grey shroud being drawn by unseen hands across the low rooftops, across the washing lines, still damp with the scent of cheap soap, across windows latched tight against the cold breath that would come creeping in after dark. Far above, on the high hill, the enchanted towers of the upper city cast down their pallid blue radiance, so remote that they seemed less a quarter where human beings dwelt than some star ensnared in the body of the city itself. Down here, where the paving stones lay split and uneven and old rain forever festered in black pools at the feet of walls, the only light came from oil lamps swaying outside shop fronts, from the steam of roadside soup stalls, from cramped taverns rank with sour ale and laughter pitched a shade too loud. Lira Vane drew her coat collar close and thrust her freezing hands into the pockets of her apron as she stepped out of Vex's shop, at the very moment her employer slid the bolt home behind her. "Early tomorrow," the old man said through the narrow crack of the door, his voice rough as a braided wood. "Someone is coming for the pendulum clock, and do not linger in the dusk market. There is nothing there but objects that learn the shape of those who touch them." Lira answered obediently out of habit, though she knew Master Vesh repeated some version of that warning nearly every week, as if this city did not already contain sufficient terrors without needing to invent sentient trinkets as well. She remained for a moment upon the chipped stone step before the shop and looked out over Taylor's Row, narrow, slanting, and already darkening into shadow. The wind moved, the mourning ribbons strung beside the undertaker's door. From the baker's stall at the end of the street drifted the faint smell of scorched butter. In an upper window across from her, someone had just blown out a candle. Ordinarily, such familiar sights soothed her, as though however narrow and worn her life might be, it was at least a thing whose edges she knew. Yet today there was in her a peculiar hollowness, a sense that since morning she had overlooked something of grave importance, or else had dropped some small, essential part of herself somewhere in the day without ever noticing its loss. Perhaps it was merely that she had endured too many indignities since dawn. A customer from the upper city had sneered that the pair of lace gloves she showed him smelled of poverty. A widow from the far quarter had haggled savagely over a picture frame chipped at one corner, as though the few coins she might save would suffice to drag her dead husband back across the threshold of death. Later, a drunken apprentice of the magical colleges had come in carrying a blackened dagger and asked the price of repair, only to laugh openly when Lira could not decipher the sigils etched into its blade. None of it was new. The lower city taught its children early that contempt was as ordinary as hunger or the first onset of winter cold. But on certain days, Lira grew so tired that even endurance long ago worn into instinct became a weight upon her shoulders, as if she were carrying stone. She had no wish to return at once to her tiny rented room. No wish to climb the narrow stair, open the rotting door, sit alone over stale bread softened in thin soup, and lie awake, reckoning whether this month's wages would stretch far enough to cover both rent and winter medicine. So instead of turning left at the end of the street toward the lodging houses, she went on, following the thinning current of bodies toward the dusk market that lay at the ragged edge of the lower city. The market opened only when evening had begun to fail, threading itself through the old walls of an abandoned monastery. It had no signboard, no gate, no appointed watchman, and yet everyone who had lived here long enough knew it existed. There one might purchase things difficult to find, difficult to explain, or best left unexplained. Objects that had passed through the hands of the dead, through church storehouses, through the cellars of noble houses, through confiscated cargoes that on paper had never existed at all. Master Veck disliked her going near the place, though he was also fond of sending her to listen for whispers of rare old goods that might be had cheaply. Lira told herself she meant only to wander, to glance, to let the evening alter its taste. If she found something useful at a low price, she might buy it for the shop. If not, then the excursion would at least spare her the silence of her room for a little longer. The entrance to the market lay between two moss-ridden stone walls taller than a man, so narrow that two carts passing abreast would have had to tilt upon their wheels. The moment Lira crossed between them, the sound of the main street seemed to slip away behind her, as though swallowed by cloth. It was darker there, yet crowded with little lights. Candles fixed in bottlenecks, oil lamps hanging low, braziers set close to the ground with their coals burning red. The cries of the vendors were nothing like the coarse exuberance of the daytime market. They came low and close instead, intimate as murmurs heard through a half-open confessional. An old woman sold rusted keys knotted into clusters. A one-armed man had laid out open music boxes upon a worn square of velvet. A girl with copper wire braided through her hair displayed eyeless porcelain dolls in a cracked glass case. Lira passed slowly from stall to stall, pausing now and again to look, yet nothing detained her for long, partly because she had little money, partly because the objects here often seemed to carry about them some delicate, nameless unease, as though at the first touch something slender and cold might pass through skin and into bone. She had nearly reached the end of one row when she noticed a low wooden table set beneath a dark awning near the mouth of an alley. The stall was so small she might have overlooked it had not some weak glimmer flashed upon metal when the lamp beside it stirred in the wind. The vendor was an old man wearing a long coat the color of earth. His hat was drawn so low that the upper half of his face lay cut away by shadow. There were fewer things upon his table than upon any of the others. A silver comb missing one tooth, a pocket mirror in a brass frame gone dark with age, a pair of mother-of-pearl studs, a small snuff box engraved with an unfamiliar bird, and several rings scattered loosely across a faded cloth of velvet. Lira could not have said precisely what drew her eye. She knew only that among all those still and silent objects, one ring made the very air around it appear a shade dimmer. It was not large, nor set with stone, nor worked with any ostentatious flourish. Only a narrow black band of metal, its surface matte as though long smoked over 1,000 hearths. Yet if one looked closely, there were tiny lines incised all around it, fine as burnt filaments of hair. It did not shine like silver, nor glow like bronze, nor carry the blunt severity of iron. Rather, it resembled a sliver of night itself, pressed into a perfect circle for the wearing of a mortal hand. "You have been looking at it for some time," the old man said. His voice was soft, not hoarse, yet ancient in some indefinable fashion, as though it had travelled to her from beyond a door long closed and seldom opened. Lira started, faintly ashamed at having been caught staring. "I was only looking. People seldom merely look at a thing they have already recognized." She frowned. "Recognized what?" The old man gave the slightest shrug beneath his coat. "There are objects that choose their keepers." Then he extended a gaunt hand and pushed the ring a little closer toward her. "Try it." She ought to have refused. Everything Master Vetch had ever warned her against, every rumor she had heard of cursed relics, every winter tale told to frighten children into obedience, should have been enough to make her step away. Yet, instead, she reached for it. Perhaps because the ring appeared so unremarkable. Perhaps because she had felt herself diminished all day, and the old man's strange phrase, "it chooses its keeper," had touched some mute and tender place of pride in her that she herself scarcely admitted. Or perhaps because from the very instant she had seen it, she had felt, with a foolishness so vivid it bordered on certainty, that the thing had been waiting for her. The moment the ring touched the tip of her finger, Lira shivered. It was so cold it seemed newly lifted from a basin of ice, but the sensation endured for no more than a breath. Then the cold withdrew inward, and in its place there spread a thin, furtive warmth through her flesh, as though some minute heated thread were winding itself around the bone of her finger. The ring slid onto the fourth finger of her right hand with a perfect fit, as though it had once been measured for her and kept in patience until now. Lira parted her lips to speak, but in that instant the whole dusk market seemed to tilt, very slightly, not truly to spin, only to sway with that strange, faint lurch that comes when one rises too quickly from a chair. The oil lamp before the old man flared brighter. In that brightness, reflected briefly upon the darkened face of the little brass mirror lying beside the ring, she caught sight of an image that belonged to no market stall and no alley in the lower city, a night sky running red with fire, tall wooden stakes thrust upright into the earth, ash lifting thick upon the air, and in the midst of that furnace, the figure of a woman standing erect in a long gown, scorched black at the hem, her dark hair driven upward by the heat. The woman's features were blurred, as if seen through water, but her eyes were unnaturally clear. There was no pleading in them, no despair. They were fixed straight upon Lira with a calm so complete it approached the terrible. Then the vision was gone. Lira drew in a sharp breath and stepped back half a pace, her heart battering against her ribs. The old man had not moved. He sat as though he had seen nothing at all. "Are you unwell?" he asked. I saw—" But the words withered there, for she herself did not know whether she had seen anything real or only some cruelty of light and reflection. She looked again at the ring now resting upon her hand. It lay there entirely still, plain and black and silent, no more than an old adornment forgotten for years in some locked drawer. "How much?" she asked, her voice lower than she intended. The old man named a sum so small it verged upon insult, less than a fraction of what any respectable silver trinket would fetch in Vec's shop. Too cheap for beauty, too cheap not to carry some hidden clause. Lira gave a small, uneasy laugh. "You would lose money at that price." "There are things," the old man replied, "that are not sold by the worth of metal." "Then by what?" This time he was silent a while before answering. "By the one who bears them away." The answer illuminated nothing, and yet by some obscure logic it compelled her. She took out her purse and counted her saved coins one by one upon the old velvet, listening to their small, dry music. While the old man gathered them up, she turned the ring lightly upon her finger. It did not pinch, it did not chafe, it did not feel alien at all. If anything, it felt so natural that it unsettled her, as though her hand had been incomplete until now, and only at this moment had received something once lost. "Where did it come from?" she asked before she turned to go. The old man tied the pouch at his belt with slow fingers. "From a place where fire has never learned to forget." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means you should not ask another question if you still desire a peaceful sleep tonight." Under ordinary circumstances, she would have been irritated by such theatrical evasions. Yet, when she looked up, a colder sensation passed along her spine. It was not his answer that caused it, but his eyes. Beneath the shadow of his hat brim they caught the oil light oddly, pale as coins left soaking too long in stagnant water. They did not seem old, nor weary, but vacant and profound, like the eyes of a carved idol. Then he blinked, and the strangeness vanished. "Go home, girl," he said, and now his voice had grown gentler. "The wind will be high tonight." Lira left the stall more quickly than she had approached it. She did not run, yet her stride shortened and quickened without her willing it. When she had gone half the length of the market row, she glanced back. The dark awning was still there at the alley's mouth, and the little points of lamplight still trembled in the gloom, yet she could no longer distinguish which table had been the old man's. Perhaps passers-by obscured it. Perhaps she had already gone too far. Perhaps she did not truly wish to see it again. All the way back to her lodging, she found herself lowering her eyes again and again to the ring upon her right hand. Against her pale skin, it looked like a trace of dried ink. Once she tried to remove it, but stopped not because it would not come free, but because a sudden and unreasonable reluctance had seized her at the very thought of parting with it. Night deepened swiftly in the lower city. By the time she reached her room, there remained in her finger that same fine and inexplicable warmth. The chamber was so small that 3 steps carried her from bed to window. Lira lit a candle, took off her coat, ate half a loaf of bread with a little hard cheese, yet all the while the image of those red flames and the woman's untroubled eyes continued to flicker at the edge of her thoughts. At length she drew a chair before the warped mirror hanging beside the bed and lifted her hand to contemplate the ring in candlelight. In the glass, her face was the same face it had always been, thin, pale, brown eyes dulled by want of sleep, black hair hastily bound at the nape. There was nothing about her to suggest the sort of chosen destiny peddled in cheap penny tales. And yet when she turned her hand and watched that dark circle close around her finger, something in her chest trembled small, hidden, almost innocent, as though some forgotten childhood delight had risen from a grave and breathed again. A beautiful thing, a secret belonging to no one but herself, something not bestowed in charity, not held in trust for the shop, not brought in by strangers to be mended and returned. Hers, entirely hers. The thought was foolish enough to make her laugh aloud, and the sound embarrassed her at once in the little room where there was no one else to hear it. Near midnight, when she extinguished the candle and slipped beneath the blanket, the ring still held its faint warmth. The wind threaded itself through the crack in the window frame with a thin, keening sound. The rumble of wagon wheels from the street below grew distant and then ceased. Lira had thought sleep might elude her, yet weariness overtook her too quickly for fear to take hold. She drifted into dreams with one hand resting upon her breast and the other curled closed, as though she were guarding something precious even in sleep. In the dream, she stood upon a vast black plain mantled in ash. There was no city there, no human voice, no recognizable sky. Only half-burnt stakes rising from the ground like a dead forest, and between them a sea of fire lifting high without giving any heat. The woman she had glimpsed in the market stepped forth from that crimson blaze, her black gown trailing over ash, her skin so white it seemed almost to emit its own light in the darkness. Her hair was long and disordered by the furnace wind. Upon the hand she raised there gleamed a dark ring, faintly bright as smouldering coal. Lira wished to draw back, yet her feet would not obey her. The woman stopped before her, so near that Lira thought she must catch the scent of smoke, yet what reached her instead was something stranger, half resin burning in a chapel brazier, half the perfume of dried flowers crushed between the pages of an old book. "At last," the woman said. Her voice was not loud, yet it sounded more distinctly in Lira's mind than in the air around them. "I have waited a very long time." Lira tried to ask who she was, but her lips would not part. The woman bent and touched the ring upon Lira's hand with one cold finger. At once the flames around them leapt higher, as if some unseen wind had fed them. "Do not be afraid," she whispered. And strangely, Lira was not. Her heart raced, but not from terror. It was the sensation of standing before a door that opened onto something too immense, too strange, too radiant for the smallness of one's allotted life, and knowing that if one crossed its threshold, nothing would ever again remain as it had been. When Lira woke, the sky beyond her window had only just begun to pale from the color of ink. The room was still cold, the blanket was still thin, her life was still the same narrow life it had been the night before. And yet her right hand burned, as though she had been holding a live coal in her sleep, and on the ring finger, where the band embraced her flesh, a dim circle of light was fading slowly away, like the last imprint of a kiss left by fire. The following morning, in Vec's shop, when the first customer laid a broken music box upon the counter, Lira looked down and saw, coiled tightly about the man's wrist, a thread as fine and black as soot smoke, smouldering faintly, as though it had only just begun to rise from ash. Lira was accustomed to beginning her mornings with things small and definite, drawing back the wooden bolt of Vec's shop, sweeping the fine skin of dust from the window ledge, changing the water in the little pewter vase where a few dried sprigs of rosemary stood, then arranging the newly mended goods upon the shelves in the order Master Vec preferred. Life generally became more bearable for her when it was cut into such small motions, because if she only performed each task correctly, she need not think beyond the next one. Yet, on that particular morning, from the very instant the man set the broken music box upon the counter, everything familiar shifted very slightly out of place, as distinctly as a crack appearing across glass. The black thread was not the sort of thing an ordinary eye might mistake for yarn, for smoke, or for a strand of hair. It was wound about the customer's wrist like a living line of ink. So fine it seemed it ought to vanish if one merely blinked, and yet whenever the man moved, it moved with him, drawing itself close against his skin in a way that made a sympathetic pain stir in Lira's own wrist, though nothing had touched her at all. She stood frozen for one heartbeat too long, long enough for the man to frown. "Girl," he asked, "can this music box be repaired?" Lira blinked and dragged herself back into the present. Yes, of course. Let me see." Her voice sounded more normal than she had expected, if a shade dry. She reached out and took the box. The moment her fingertips brushed the dark wood, worn bare where the varnish had peeled away, something strange passed through her swift as a breath, as though someone had exhaled a thread of winter directly into her palm. At the same instant, the thread coiled around the man's wrist flashed the color of ash and then darkened again. Lira drew her hand back by instinct. The customer did not notice. He merely rubbed the back of his neck, looking tired. "It stopped singing by itself last night," he muttered. "My daughter cried half the night through, says she cannot sleep without the tune." Lira nodded, though her gaze remained fixed upon the black thread. It was not still. It was stirring, almost imperceptibly, like a leech engorged beneath the man's skin that only she could see. A chill moved up her spine, but with it rose something else as well, sharper and brighter, akin to the first keen curiosity one feels upon discovering a concealed door in a house one has always known. The ring on her finger grew warm, not with the searing heat it had borne when she first woke, but with enough warmth to remind her that it was there, awake, attentive with her. "What is the matter with you?" the man asked again, and there was impatience in his tone now. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Lira shook her head too quickly. "No, I only slept badly." She lowered her gaze to the music box and opened it to avoid his eyes. Inside, the winding mechanism seemed outwardly sound. The gears were aligned. The spring was unbroken. Everything looked cleaner, newer even, than many things she had repaired before. Yet even upon that pale metal she saw tiny black flecks gathered in the joints like soot caught in the workings. Not true dust. They seemed made of the same substance as the thread about the man's wrist, only fainter, finer. Her curiosity deepened. She did not form the thought in words, and yet something very like a thought that was not her own moved through her mind. "Touch it." Lira swallowed. "Would you mind waiting a little?" she asked. "I can try." The man seemed eager to have it back at once. He dragged a chair near the counter and sat down, drumming his fingers against the tabletop. Master Vec was in the storeroom behind the shop, rummaging among crates of old clocks. Had he heard the exchange, he would have thought only that Lira was repairing another object in the ordinary course of the day. She set the music box down upon a square of felt. The ring on her hand grew warmer still. She drew a slow breath and brought the fingers of her right hand toward one of the black flecks within the mechanism. They trembled, as though stirred by a wind. At the instant her fingertip touched one, a lance of pain, fine and savage as a needle, shot through her nail and all the way to her elbow. Lira pressed her lips together to keep from crying out. The black mark clung to her skin, twisting into a smaller, livelier thread. Reflexively she jerked her hand back, but the ring tightened very slightly around her finger, as though keeping her hand precisely where it must remain. Then awareness poured straight into her mind, complete, precise, and so immediate as to be horrifying. This was a weak curse, no more than a remnant of malice, clinging to the music box and passing itself into its owner, choking sound in the mechanism, troubling sleep, laying a little more heaviness upon the chest of whatever hands opened the lid each night. Only a little, only enough, until eventually someone frailer would sicken. Lira did not know how she understood this. She knew only that she did, and with that knowledge came another sensation, sweet and perilous as strong wine. She could draw it out. She could do something. She, not some mage of the upper city, not a priest in some high temple, not one of those who forever looked down upon her as though she were another useless thing of the lower city. Her hand trembled. In her mind, very softly, as though from some immeasurable distance beyond thick glass, came the whisper of a woman's voice, soft as ash drifting over flame, separated from its vessel. "Do not be afraid." Lira did not know whether she truly heard it or merely imagined it, but her body obeyed before her reason could intervene. She pinched the black fleck between two fingers. It was freezing, slick as oil, yet when the ring came nearer, the thread recoiled and showed itself clearly now, as a grey filament rooted deep into the seams of the gears. Lira pulled, not with bodily strength. It felt instead like drawing a thorn from flesh by the force of thought alone. The thread came free of the music box, writhed once upon her fingertip, and then vanished into a single speck of black ash. At the same moment, the man's wrist jerked. The thread wrapped around it split in the middle and began to fade, thinning like smoke taken by the wind. Inside the box, one little gear moved. Then music began. A tune slight and delicate and a little out of key, but true music nonetheless. So clear that both Lira and the customer stared in equal disbelief. The man sprang to his feet. "It works?" he asked, looking more astonished than delighted. "What did you just do?" Lira stared at her own fingertip. There was no mark left there, save for the faintest red line. Her heart was beating so violently she could hear it in her ears. The pain had gone. In its place ran a strange trembling through her chest and belly. Not altogether fear. It was nearer to exhilaration, a sensation she had known only in very early childhood, those rare moments when she had nearly touched the first snow of winter, or heard a story so wondrous she forgot her hunger. "I adjusted the spring, that is all," she lied. The man understood nothing, but the music box was playing, and that was enough for him. He paid, and even added a small silver coin for having it done faster than expected. After he had gone, Lira remained standing behind the counter, staring at her right hand as though it belonged to someone else. Master Vec emerged then from the storeroom holding a cracked clock face. "Who just paid extra?" he asked, squinting. "A cheerful sort, was he?" Lira hid her hand in the fold of her skirt. "He was in a hurry, so he paid generously." "Lucky you," the old man muttered, bending down toward the wooden chest that held loose keys. He did not see her expression, nor the ring dimming again after giving off the faintest circle of grey light. The rest of the morning passed as though through a thin veil. Lira continued to work, to make entries in the ledger, to hand goods over to customers, yet her attention kept stealing back to her right hand. Whenever she had a quiet moment, she tried to remember exactly how it had felt to pull that black thread out of the music box, the feeling of understanding without having learned, the sensation of touching what others could not perceive, the thrill of altering something with her own hand. Part of her insisted it was wrong, dangerous, unnatural. Another part answered only, silently, "But it is beautiful." Near midday, when the shop had fallen quiet, Master Vec sent her to deliver a repaired picture frame to a widow on Herb Lane. Lira took the frame, wrapped herself in her coat, and stepped into a wind sharper than the morning's. The sky remained grey, but there was a thin noonlight striking the wet stones. She passed the soup stall, the candle makers, a knot of children kicking an empty tin at the foot of the boarding-house stairs. Among them was little Toma, son of the laundress, who rented the room at the end of Lira's corridor. The boy often coughed on cold nights and was always pale as flour. Today he was not running about with the others, but sat hunched upon the step, both hands clasped over his chest. "Toma?" Lira stopped. "Are you all right?" The boy looked up. His eyes were dry, but exhaustion lay over his face like illness. "I cannot breathe properly," he whispered. "My mother went to wash linens. She has not come back yet." The moment Lira bent toward him, she saw it. Around the child's chest, beneath the old woolen sweater, spread a dark webbing drawn tight, far denser than the thread she had seen wound about the customer's wrist that morning. It did not merely coil around him from without. Those black lines burrowed beneath the skin as well, rooted into his small ribcage like tendrils driven into soil. Lira went cold. This was no remnant of malice clinging to an object. This was something feeding itself upon the child. Toma doubled over, coughing. Each cough made the black web tremble and tighten further. "Go inside," Lira said, though even to herself she could hear the uselessness in the suggestion. He could not walk, and in that same instant she understood that she could help him, not by reason, not because she was clever. The knowledge simply poured into her again, whole and cold and lucid. She could draw it out, if she touched the right place. More dangerous than the thing in the music box, more painful, but possible. Toma raised his wet, unfocused eyes to hers. "Lira." She knelt, setting the picture frame aside. "Listen to me," she said softly, though her hand had already begun to shake. "Whatever happens, do not move too much." "Are you a mage?" he asked, his voice trembling somewhere between fear and hope. Lira nearly laughed. On any day before this one, it would have been the most absurd thing she had ever heard. She, Lira Vane of the second-hand shop, with worn heels and a damp little room, was a mage? Yet the ring on her finger grew hot, as though clasping itself to her bones, and some clumsy, infant pride, new and fierce and wholly unfamiliar, touched her heart. "No," she said, "but I am going to help you." She laid her right hand against the boy's chest where the black web was thickest. The cold struck her palm with such violence that she nearly snatched her hand away. Toma held his breath. The dark strands writhed at once, as though they knew they had been touched. In Lira's mind, the woman's voice grew clearer, impossibly gentle. "Yes, take hold of it. Do not let it hide." Lira clenched her teeth. She drove her will into that blackness in a manner she herself did not understand, as though her hand were no longer only flesh and bone, but also some kind of hook capable of catching hold of the unseen. She felt it. A cold, slick knot buried in the child's chest, spasming like a small animal dragged suddenly into light. Lira pulled. Toma cried out. Pain knifed through her whole body, not only her hand but her jaw, her throat, the length of her spine. The black lines tore free of the boy's chest and collapsed into a writhing clot of greasy smoke between her fingers. In that instant, Lira saw something else, an image forced into her vision from without. A woman in a grey mantle standing beside Toma's bed some nights earlier, holding a bundle of half-burned herbs and muttering over him. Then the image shattered. Lira gasped. The black clot in her hand writhed violently, rasping against her skin with a burn that was almost like claws. By instinct she clenched her fist. The ring flared with a thread of grey-red light. The black mass ignited, became a single grain of ash, and vanished. Sudden silence fell over the steppe. Toma sat very still for 1 second, then 2, and then drew in a deep breath. A full breath, unbroken, soundless. He blinked again and again, as though he scarcely trusted his own body. I can breathe, he said, one hand touching his chest with foolish astonishment. Then he laughed. It was the laugh of a child newly escaped from fever, light and ridiculous enough that Lira laughed too, though tears had risen to her eyes for reasons she could not have named. She sat down heavily on the step, her right hand still burning as though it held the heart of a coal. Her pulse was wild, yet now fear was all but swept away by something else, a fierce, bewildered joy, almost dizzying in its force. She had saved a child, not by chance, not by luck, by her own hand. Toma flung his arms around her neck. "You are so clever," he cried. Those simple words struck somewhere very deep in Lira. Clever, capable. The notion was so foreign when turned toward her that it sounded as though he were naming another person. In her mind, the woman's voice came again, clearer now than ever, as though she stood directly behind her. "Do you see now?" Lira turned sharply. There was no one there. Only the narrow yard, the washing lines stirring, the shuttered windows. A few passers-by at the mouth of the street glanced over and walked on. Her breathing had grown quick and shallow. She ought to have been frightened. She knew she ought. Yet instead a slow smile, helpless and strange, came over her mouth. She lowered her gaze to her right hand. The black ring lay there in silence, discreet and plain, no different from the cheap trinket she had bought at the dusk market the night before. And yet in that instant it was more beautiful than any gem she had ever seen, gleaming in the pawn-shop window at the end of the street. That evening, after delivering the picture frame later than usual and enduring the widow's scolding for her tardiness, Lira returned to her room with her mind lit from within. She ate almost nothing, locked the door, drew the curtain, and set a candle upon the table by the mirror. Not to study her own reflection. She wanted to try again, only a little. Only enough to prove to herself that morning and afternoon had not been fever or dream. There was not much in her room to experiment upon. An old lock, a mirror framed in pewter and cracked at one corner, a sewing box, a dark wooden comb, a few books borrowed from Master Vech which she had not yet finished. Lira set them one by one upon the table and held her hand above them, trying to feel as she had that morning. At first there was nothing. Then, little by little, the world seemed to lift one more veil. Upon the lock there clung a pale black residue in the key teeth, the remnant of some crude ward that had made it stick for months. On the mirror's face there lay a dim stain in one corner, like the shadow left behind by too many cruel words once spoken before it. Lira touched the ward upon the lock. This time it was easier. She drew it out as though pulling a fine thread from beneath a fingernail, and heard a small, clean click. The lock opened. She burst into laughter there alone, a quick, bright sound so unlike herself that it startled her. She tried next with the stain upon the mirror, but managed only to thin it a little before a headache drove her to stop. Even so, it was enough. The whole room seemed larger now, brighter, more real. Lira turned the lock over and over in her hand, opening and closing it simply for the pleasure of the impossible thing she had done. No one was there to witness her. No one knew. The secrecy of it only deepened the delight. When at last she sat down upon the bed, she realized she was smiling like a fool. It had been a very long time since she had felt joy without reason, not the small joy of unexpectedly extra money, nor of some rare and savory meal. This was something deeper, brighter, almost painful in its intensity. And then a thought, bold enough to border on blasphemy, rose softly in her mind. Perhaps her life would be different now. She did not speak it aloud. She scarcely dared to shape it fully, yet it remained there, warm as breath beneath winter blankets. Later still, when the wind beyond the window had quieted, Lira lay on her back staring up at the grey moulded ceiling and lifted her ringed hand above her. In the last candlelight, the ring looked like a circle of darkness clasping her finger. "What are you?" she whispered. No answer came in words. Only that faint increase of warmth in the metal, as though the thing were smiling in its own private fashion. And then, just as the candle gave a final sputter and the room sank into blackness, a voice breathed beside her ear. So close she felt cold brush the rim of it. "Beautiful. Come a little nearer." Lira jerked upright, her heart beating itself half-mad. The room was empty. The door was still locked. The curtain had not stirred. There was only darkness, and her hand burning as though someone had just enclosed it within another hand. Lira sat motionless on the bed for a long while after that whisper, her back rigid, her right hand pressed hard against her chest as though, if she let go, her heart might leap straight out through her ribs. There was nothing in the room, except the familiar darkness, the faint smell of extinguished candle wax, and the wind brushing against the edge of the window frame. She could hear every small sound with painful clarity, the timber shrinking in the cold of night, someone coughing in the room across the corridor, the distant rattle of a late cart over stone. No footsteps, no breathing but her own. And yet she knew with absolute certainty that she had heard that voice. It had not come to her in the ordinary way sound entered the ear, like the wind or the passing wheels. It had been nearer than that, stranger, as though the whisper had been laid directly against the inner side of her flesh. "Who's there?" she asked, very softly, and at once the question struck her as so foolish she nearly laughed from fear. No answer came. Only the ring upon her hand continued to hold its mild, persistent warmth, like some living thing gone still, in order to observe its mistress's reaction. Lira swallowed, pushed the blanket aside, and climbed from the bed to light the candle again. A small yellow flame rose up, throwing her shadow long and distorted across the mold-stained wall. She checked the door. The bolt was still fastened. The window was shut, its little brass hook still in place. Under the bed there was nothing, save an old valise and a chipped enamel basin. She knew she would find nothing, and yet she had to look, if only to quiet the panic beating in her blood. At last she sat down in the chair, elbows on her knees, and stared into the candle flame. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps she had simply done, since morning, too many things utterly alien to the life she had known before. Perhaps when a human being begins to touch what she cannot understand, the mind invents voices of its own to fill the void. Lira tried to force herself to believe those plain and sensible explanations. She was only tired, only frightened. But beneath all those reasonable thoughts there remained something else, something thin and bright and almost eager, still quietly alive within her. Some part of her did not want that voice to vanish. Some part of her wanted to hear it again, wanted to know to whom it belonged, wanted to know what was opening before her. That thought made her turn away from the candle as though she were ashamed even before herself. In the end, she managed only a brief and uneasy sleep toward dawn. She did not dream of fire, nor of the woman again, but only that she was wandering through a very long corridor lined with mirrors, and in every mirror her own hand was raised, the black ring upon her finger like an eye opening in the dark. When she woke, she was tired, but strangely not crushed by it. On the contrary, the feeling from the day before remained within her like a warm underground current running beneath ice. It made her steps lighter as she went down into the street, made her face in the cloudy scrap of mirror at the end of the corridor seem altered by the slightest degree. Not prettier, not brighter in the cheap, sentimental manner of romantic tales, but more alive somehow, as though after years of walking with her head bowed through her allotted days, some very small flame had now been lit in her eyes, and she herself was still unaccustomed to seeing it there. Vex's shop opened later than usual because the old man had wrenched his back the day before, trying to lift a heavy cabinet alone. Lira took advantage of the delay to sweep and tidy the front room by herself. She knew she ought to behave as ordinarily as possible, but the thought was almost useless. For to her, the world that morning was no longer ordinary at all. The instant the light through the front glass struck the shelves, the faint grey traces she had glimpsed only dimly the day before began to show themselves with greater clarity. Upon an ebony jewelry box there clung a thin skin of black smoke around the hinges, the remnant of jealousy from some former owner. On the glass of the clock cabinet there were tiny black motes caught like dust, yet each gave off a different chill, one of long stagnant sorrow, another of petty malice, another of some little curse not yet wholly spent. She moved from object to object, with her heart beating high and quick in her chest. The lower city was unchanged, the shop unchanged, the wares lying where they had always lain, and yet now they revealed a second life beneath the first, one that only she could feel. The sensation made her almost want to laugh. "Lira, stop mooning and hand me that box of nails," Master Vex snapped from behind her. She started, turned, and hastened to obey. The old man leaned on the counter and peered at her over the spectacles sliding down his nose. "What have you been smiling at all morning?" Lira touched the corner of her mouth and realized, with surprise, that she had indeed been smiling. "Nothing at all." "Then stop grinning with that dreamy face of yours." "The customers will think the shop's been taken by spirits," he muttered under his breath and went back to his ledgers. Lira bit her lip to keep still, but the covert happiness in her would not be quenched. All through the morning, whenever she laid hands on something bearing one of those dim black traces, she tested, very lightly, whether she could still do it. With an old drawer lock she tugged a scrap of stubborn warding free, and it opened at once with perfect ease. With a little silver-framed mirror clouded by some lingering cold, she touched the faint smoke upon the glass and watched it dissolve like breath in sunlight. With a paring knife, whose hilt carried a streak of acrid malice, she closed her hand around it and felt that streak shrivel into a speck and disappear. Each time, the ring grew warm, her fingertips tingled, and within her rose that same exquisite and peculiar pleasure, something between pride and hunger. She was no longer merely curious. She had begun to look forward to the next time. At midday, Master Vetch sent her to return a handful of small goods to the tailor at the end of the street, and then stop by the market for fresh needles. Lira went at once, and on the way, for the first time in her life, she became aware that she was walking among other people, carrying a secret that made the whole street seem smaller. The housewives with baskets of greens on their arms, the apprentices hurrying with bundles of papers, the cartmen arguing at the corner, the old woman selling onion cakes, none of them knew that the girl slipping past them could see the dim stains they never noticed, could touch the things clinging to sleeves and ribs, and to the objects in their hands. The thought did not make her despise them. It only left her strangely light-headed. For the first time, she did not feel herself to be merely one more anonymous grey shade among the lower city's multitude. She was the one holding a door no one else could see. She stopped at Mistress Merrin's cloth stall at the mouth of the lane, because the old woman called her over and asked whether the small tin sewing box had jammed again. Lira took it from her by habit, and at once saw a very fine black trace wound around the inner hinge. She drew it out so easily that it scarcely required thought. The lid sprang open. Mistress Merrin widened her eyes, then burst into delighted laughter. "Well now, Vex girl has magic hands today." Lira laughed too, and lied that perhaps the oil she had used last week had finally seeped through. The old woman pushed 2 hard honey biscuits into her hand and told her to keep them, since a girl who has luck with objects ought to be fed. Lira thanked her and walked on, feeling as though some invisible wind had lifted her from the ground. At the market, she deliberately lingered longer than necessary among the ironmongers' stalls, only to see how many dark traces she could discern among the hooks and folding knives and sewing shears and old silver bowls. Almost every object that had passed through many hands retained something. She did not touch them all. She stood only and looked, yet even that was enough to enthrall her. Had the world always possessed this hidden layer, or was the ring itself transfiguring it before her eyes? She wondered, but not with any real wish for an answer. She was too busy taking pleasure in it. That afternoon, upon returning to the shop, something occurred that turned her sweet exhilaration into something nearer pride. The drunken magic apprentice from the day before came back. He was still very young, only a little older than Lira, dressed in the grey-blue robe of the magical college, though his collar was disordered, and his speech already smelled of wine, though it was barely past noon. He had come to collect the dagger he had brought for repair, but the moment he stepped inside, he resumed the same mocking tone as before. "Where's my blade, little girl of the junk shop?" he asked, tapping the butt of his stick against the counter. "Or did you fail to read A Student of the Arcane again and throw it away?" Master Vesh hated customers of this kind, but because the fellow had paid generously last time, he only swallowed his irritation and jerked his chin toward the wooden box on the shelf. Lira went to fetch it. The instant she picked up the dagger, she saw about its hilt a thin black coil like a withered vine, giving off a cold, rancorous feeling sharp enough to sense without touch. It was no protective charm. It was something closer to a retaliatory curse, doubtless engraved to wound any hand not permitted to wield it. The day before she had not understood the symbols, but now, as her fingers drew near, their meaning blossomed into her mind as a clear and immediate sensation. The apprentice stretched out his hand for the weapon, the edge of his mouth curled as though expecting her to blunder. Lira looked at his jeering face, then at the black coil around the hilt, and a thought both reckless and irresistibly tempting slid through her mind. I could turn it. I could let him taste a little of the thing he uses to frighten other people. She ought to have let it go, ought to have pretended not to see. But the morning had been too easy, noon too delightful, and the growing sense that she now possessed something stronger than the contempt of those above her had swelled enough to push caution from its feet. She tightened her hold on the dagger, drew the black coil from where it clung, and twisted it in another direction, like knotting a ribbon of smoke. The movement was so slight and swift that no one but she noticed it. When the apprentice snatched the dagger from her, the newly turned curse lay sleeping within the hilt. He threw a few coins onto the counter and gave a derisive laugh. "Next time find yourself a dictionary of sigils, won't you? Or people might start thinking you lower city lot are genuinely illiterate." Then he turned on his heel. Lira watched him go, her heart beating fast with excitement and the first faint pang of guilt. Master Vetch muttered something about insolent whelps. 10 seconds later, from outside the door, there came a sharp oath. The apprentice had stopped in the middle of the street, his face twisted, the hand holding the dagger jerking as though struck by some hidden current. The dagger clanged to the stones. Several passers-by turned to look. He staggered, clutching his other wrist, staring in wild incomprehension. It lasted only a moment. The twisted curse rebounded upon him just strongly enough to sting and scorch, not enough to do lasting harm. Lira stood inside the shop, watching through the dirty glass, and felt a fierce rush of pleasure blaze in her chest. Not because he was in pain, but because she had done it. She had touched something he knew nothing of, had used the hidden mechanism beneath the skin of the world itself to turn the balance in accordance with her will. The apprentice snatched the dagger up, spat another curse, and hurried away, pale-faced. Master Vetch gave a dry, wheezing chuckle. "There now. Talk too rudely, and objects start to hate you." He meant it as a joke, not knowing how near the truth he had come. Lira turned away to hide the smile growing too wide upon her face. That evening, when the shop had closed, she did not go straight home but made instead for the dusk market again. She walked faster than before, her heart keeping time with a sense of anticipation she no longer bothered to conceal from herself. She wanted to find the old man who had sold her the ring. Wanted to ask him what it was, wanted to know why he had sold it to her for so little, and deeper still than all those questions, she wanted to tell someone that it was marvelous, that she could see invisible things, that she could touch them, that her whole grey life, in the span of 2 days, had suddenly become bright enough to verge on flame. But when she arrived, the alley still held its market, with candles, hawkers, low murmured cries, all as before, except that the little stall beneath the dark awning was gone. In its place sat a middle-aged woman selling coarse wool scarves and hand-knitted stockings, no faded velvet, no little brass-framed mirror, no old man with eyes pale as coins long soaked in water. Lira walked the length of the row, then turned back and searched it again, trying to remember whether she had mistaken the place. No, the stall had truly vanished. She asked the scarf seller whether an old man with metal wares had been there the night before. The woman narrowed her eyes at her as one might look at a child, asking after ghosts. "There's always a handful of old men selling metal scraps here," she said. "Which old man do you mean?" Lira did not know how to describe him. He had a small table, rings, hat pulled low. The woman shrugged. "That sounds like half the market." The banality of the answer made Lira feel ridiculous. She stood still among the press of people, fingers absently turning the ring. It had gone cool again, no longer warm as it was when she used her power. Around her the oil lamps quivered, and the murmur of voices ran like water over stone. Everything was so ordinary that her own confusion sharpened almost painfully. Who had that old man been? Why could she not remember his face clearly, though she had seen him only last night? Had he known what the ring was? And if he had, why had he chosen her? Lira left the market long after full dark had fallen. The joy within her had not faded, but it was now overlaid with a thin film of unease. She still remembered the sensation of the black coil rebounding into the apprentice's hand, and in that memory there was not only exhilaration but something cold as a knife touching a tooth. She told herself she would be more careful. She must not act rashly, must not let anyone notice. Yet even while thinking so, she could not prevent her mind from counting secretly toward the next time. When she reached the head of Taylor's Row, she was suddenly seized by the sensation that someone was watching her, not the passing glance of a stranger. A gaze held long, still, and patient. Lira stopped. The evening wind struck cold against her collar. She turned and looked about her. The street was busy enough not to seem lonely. A husband and wife quarreling in front of the soup stall, an old man dragging a coal cart, two seamstresses returning late, a child running past with a hot loaf hugged to his chest. Nothing out of place. But then her eyes came to rest on the opposite side of the street, beneath the narrow awning of the abandoned house at the end of the lane. A man was standing there, dark coat, collar turned up, hat drawn low over his brow. He was too far away for her to distinguish his face, only the pale line of his chin and the peculiar stillness of his posture amidst all the surrounding motion. He was not smoking, not speaking, not shifting his weight. He simply stood there looking directly across at her. Lira stopped breathing. In that instant, the ring on her finger grew warm, not with its former gentleness, but with the warning sharpness of a heated needle. She did not know who the man was, nor how long he had been standing there, but with a certainty she could not explain, she understood that his gaze was not upon her out of idle curiosity or chance. It was fixed on her right hand, on her hand, and the ring. A child darted across the street between them, blocking her view for no more than half a second. When the child had passed, the man was still there, motionless, waiting. Lira felt the sweet joy of the past 2 days recede slightly, exposing the colder foundation beneath it. She began walking again, not so quickly as to betray herself, but not slowly either. One shop, then another, then the mouth of the alley leading toward her lodging, and she glanced sideways once more. The man had left the awning. He was no longer there, not in the street, not leaning against a wall, not lost among the moving crowd. It was as though he had never been there at all. Lira faltered for half a heartbeat beneath the jaundiced glow of an oil lamp. Then, from directly behind her, very near, a man's low voice spoke with a courtesy so precise it was chilling. "You wear it rather conspicuously." Lira startled so violently she nearly cried out. She spun around at once, her shoulder striking the damp wall of the alley hard enough to send flakes of old lime crumbling down into her collar. The man stood behind her no more than an arm's length away. Seen at such proximity, he looked younger than she had first thought, or perhaps merely not yet old, narrow-faced, clean-shaven, with the pallor of someone who spent little time in sunlight. His black coat was not opulent, yet it was cut with a precision and restraint that did not belong to the lower city. Beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were a pale grey, so still that anyone meeting them would instinctively wish to retreat half a step. It was not that they were savage. It was their composure that chilled her. This was not a man who needed to raise his voice in order to frighten anyone. "Who are you?" Lira asked, trying to keep her voice from trembling, though she could hear her own breathing far too clearly. The man did not answer at once. His gaze dropped to her right hand. By reflex, Lira curled her fingers inward, hiding the ring in her palm. The movement made one corner of his mouth stir, though not enough to become a smile. "Someone who wishes to advise you," he said, "that if you intend to remain alive, You would do well not to let that thing show again." "I don't know what you mean." The words were weak, useless, and Lira knew it as she spoke them, yet she had nothing else to cling to. The man tilted his head slightly, as though weighing whether her clumsiness merited pity. "You will understand soon enough," he said. "Sooner than you would like." Then his attention shifted past her shoulder toward the main street. Lira did not turn, but she heard it clearly enough. The steady strike of studded boots on stone, several pairs, measured rather than hurried. A church patrol. The habits of the lower city taught one to recognize that sound even in the middle of panic. The man in black stepped backward into the shadow of the alley, as if the darkness itself had opened to receive him. "If they ask," he continued in that same courteous tone, "tell them you have never seen me." Wait. Lira had no time to ask anything more. The patrol passed the mouth of the alley, and in the instant she turned her head by instinct to glance toward them, the man was gone. He had not run. He had not slipped down any side passage she could see. He simply was no longer there. Lira stood motionless between the wet wall and the faintly trembling oil lamp, her heart beating so fast that both ears seemed to burn with it. 3 soldiers of the Church of the Ashen Pillar passed the alley entrance. They wore ash-grey coats over leather armor, with the emblem of a silvered column of flame stitched upon the breast. The man in the middle carried a small brass cage, inside which hung a dull crystal giving off a wan, sputtering light like the breath of something about to die. That light swept slowly over the paving stones, the walls, the closed doors. When it passed near where Lira stood, the ring upon her hand suddenly burned hot. Startled, she jammed her right hand into the folds of her skirt and pressed it hard against her thigh, as though she might conceal it inside her own flesh. The crystal in the brass cage brightened slightly, only slightly. The soldier holding it halted and turned his head. "Something there?" one of the others asked. "I thought—" The one with the lantern began, and then the glow dimmed again. He frowned. "No." "Must have been the last alley." The 3 of them moved on. The sound of their boots receded. Only when it had dissolved entirely into the murmur of the night street did Lira realize she had been holding her breath. She let her back fall against the wall, her thoughts in turmoil. Who had that man been? How did he know about the ring? What was that crystal cage the church carried? And most of all, how was it that 2 days ago her life had circled quietly between an old curiosity shop, a boarding house, and a handful of familiar streets, and now every dark corner seemed capable of hiding a stranger staring at her hand as though it were some rare animal? She remained there only a few seconds longer, then nearly ran all the way back to her room. On the rickety wooden staircase leading to the second floor, she almost collided with the widow from the room at the head of the corridor. The woman grumbled, but Lira offered only a hurried apology before slipping inside her room and slamming the door shut. She leaned her whole weight against it, her right hand still burning. The small, dark, narrow room suddenly felt safer than anything in the world. She lit a candle, drew the curtain, checked the bolt twice. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and opened her hand. The black ring rested upon her finger, still and silent, as if it had never caused any trouble at all. Yet Lira no longer looked at it as a beautiful secret belonging to her alone. It was still beautiful, still alluring in that quiet and shadowed way that made her want to keep touching it. But now, for the first time, she could see the shadow it cast beyond the boundaries of this room. A strange man, a crystal cage carried by the church. A sentence with no beginning and no end. You wear it rather conspicuously. "What are you?" she whispered, uncertain whether she was addressing the ring itself or whatever stood behind it. She waited. Part of her feared that if a voice answered again, she would truly go mad. Another part wanted it to speak at once, if only to give her something clear to grasp. At first, there was only silence. Then, very gently, warmth rose from the ring and wound itself around her finger like a touch. And in her mind the woman's voice returned, not close beside her ear, as it had been the night before, but sounding through her thoughts like a remembered voice from a dream sunk too deep to reach. "They have caught the scent of ash." Lira went still. "Who are you?" she asked aloud. "I am what remains of the fire." It was not truly an answer, more like a fragment of image, an idea pressed into her mind. What is this ring? Why do they know it? Because they feared it once. Because they still do. Who fears it? But the voice had already begun to retreat like the ebb of a tide. Only the last trace of warmth remained in the metal. Lira clenched both hands, angry that she could get nothing plain from it. Angrier still that even now her heart was racing not only with fear, but with something else gathering strength within her. Exhilaration. They were tracking the ring. They possessed instruments to detect it. That strange man had looked at it as one looks at something already named. All of that ought to have filled her with regret. She ought to have torn it off at once, wrapped it in cloth, and thrown it into the Black River at the edge of the city, or buried it beneath some crooked tree in the pauper's graveyard. And yet instead she found herself looking down at her hand, a strange shiver running the length of her spine. So it truly mattered. It was not some private madness, not a delusion born of a poor girl too exhausted by her old life. It was something grave enough to send steel-cold men hunting through the night. A real secret, a real power. That knowledge made her want, all at once, both to hide the ring more deeply and never to part with it again. In the end, Lira slept very little. The next morning she arrived at the shop earlier than usual, partly because she could not bear to remain in bed, partly because she dreaded being alone with her thoughts. Taylor's Row lay damp and cold as always, but now she seemed to find signs everywhere. More church patrols passing than usual, fresh notices pasted up at the market corner, 2 ash-coated soldiers talking beneath the awning of the baker's shop. Perhaps she noticed such things only because she had become watchful, or perhaps the city had truly shifted while she was not looking. Master Vetch opened late, muttering about his back and the rising price of lamp oil. All morning Lira forced herself to work as though everything were ordinary, yet every unfamiliar footstep beyond the glass door made her flinch. Every customer who entered the shop she studied more closely than courtesy allowed. Several times the ring grew faintly warm when she noticed black traces on objects brought in for repair, as though reminding her that the door remained open, and that made matters worse. Fear did not take the gift away from her. On the contrary, it seemed only to sharpen it. Near noon, a woman brought in a silver hairpin so steeped in cold that Lira's fingertips went numb when she touched it. She ought to have handed it to Master Vetch for valuation and then put it aside. Yet the familiar temptation rose again. Only a little, she thought, only to see whether she still had control of it while frightened. She sat at the work table behind the counter, head bent low as though examining the clasp. The black trace on the hairpin showed itself before her, thin as a sleeping worm nestled between 2 engraved lines. She touched it, pulled. The cold streak slipped free of the silver, wound itself briefly up her hand, and dissolved. The hairpin gleamed more brightly at once beneath the lamp, and at the same moment there surged through Lira's chest a sensation at once familiar and dangerous. Joy, brief, sharp, but real enough that she lifted her head in astonishment and delight. She could still do it. She had not lost it merely because she was being watched in the streets. She was still stronger than she had been 2 days ago, stronger than she had been last week, stronger than at any other point in her life. The thought blazed in her mind, beautiful and innocent as the first flame in a house about to burn. Lira. Master Vetch's voice sounded so near that she nearly dropped the hairpin. The old man stood in the doorway to the storeroom, ledger in hand, his gaze fixed upon the object in hers. "Finished already?" "Almost," she said. "I didn't hear you use oil." He took a step toward her, slow, but there was something cautious now in his old eyes. "Your hands have become mighty lucky these last few days." Lira forced herself to smile. "Perhaps I simply understand the objects better now." Master Vetch grunted something indistinct, but asked no more. Even so, throughout the rest of the afternoon she could feel him looking at her more often than usual, not exactly with suspicion, but like a man hearing some strange sound in a familiar house and not yet knowing where it comes from. That was enough to make Lira decide she must be more careful after the shop closed. She wrapped a strip of old cloth around her wrist and right hand, pretending the skin had cracked from the winter cold. The ring vanished beneath the dark, grey binding, hidden at last. When she stepped out of the shop at dusk, she turned deliberately away from the direction of the dusk market and took a longer route through Herb Lane before heading back toward the boarding house, merely to see whether anyone still followed her. At first, everything seemed harmless enough. The usual passers-by, the smell of onion soup, coal smoke, and old rain rising from the stones. a newspaper seller shouting the evening news of a theft in some upper city warehouse. Lira walked slowly, trying not to turn her head too often. But when she reached the little stone bridge crossing the black canal at the edge of the fish market, the ring beneath the cloth suddenly flared so hot she nearly cried out. The heat was nothing like the warmth she felt when using it. This was warning, sharp and urgent. Lira stopped. Reflected in the foul water below were not only the oil lamps set at either end of the bridge, but a pale beam of light sweeping slowly along the wall behind her. Crystal light. She did not turn at once. The lower city had taught her long ago that sometimes pretending not to notice is the reason one survives. She kept walking, 1 step, 2, 3. Behind her, footsteps followed, keeping the same measured distance. Then a woman's voice came from her right, beneath the awning of a fish stall already shuttered for the night. "Miss, you dropped your handkerchief." Lira turned by reflex. There was no fishwife there, only a young woman in a deep blue cloak, smiling with excessive politeness, both hands empty. Her eyes dropped at once to Lira's right hand, wrapped in cloth. Trap. Lira understood at the very moment the light behind her swept brighter. She lunged forward. "Stop!" someone shouted. Footsteps broke into a run from 2 directions at once. Lira tore across the bridge, her coat skimming the wet stone railing. She had no idea who they all were, only that at least one carried a crystal cage, and the woman who had called to her did not look like Church. That made everything worse. More than one faction was hunting the ring. The street ahead split into 3 branches. Lira darted left into a narrow lane between a blacksmith shop and an old warehouse, hearing someone close behind. She could run better than many who looked at her might guess, simply because the poor must learn to move quickly, to keep pace with necessity, and sometimes to flee the hands that grow unkind after dark. But those following her were no drunkards, no rowdy street boys. They did not shout in confusion. They were cutting off the lane with practiced ease. A figure appeared ahead of her in ash grey. The Church. Lira faltered for half a second too long. Those behind were almost upon her. And then, in the instant when her whole body turned cold with the realization that there was no clean path left, the ring upon her hand suddenly blazed with a bright heat, like coal struck by wind, and for the first time, Lira did not merely feel through it, she saw by means of it. Fine black lines were braided around the wrist of the churchman before her, running up into the crystal cage he held. A binding mark, both detection and tether. She understood by instinct. If she broke it, the crystal light would die. The thought had barely flashed through her when she acted. Lira tore her right hand free of the cloth binding, snatched at the air between herself and the soldier as though seizing an invisible cord, and yanked hard. Agony shot through her fingertips. The soldier hissed. The black lines around his wrist snapped free and curled into the space between them like a knot of smoke drawn tight. Lira twisted her wrist by instinct. The smoke twisted with it. The crystal cage in his hand went dark. At the same instant he crumpled, clutching his wrist as though scalded by heated iron. Behind her, the woman in blue swore under her breath. The alley was dim, only a few splashes of oil light staining the walls, but in Lira's eyes that moment burned with brightness. Not because of the lamps, because of power. She had just extinguished one of their tracking devices with a single wrench of her hand. The sheer magnitude of it rose through her so violently that for one dangerous instant she almost forgot she was being hunted. That very intoxication made her stumble into her mistake. She paused half a second too long to look at her own hand. Half a second was enough for the woman in blue to throw a slender knife. It was not aimed at Lira's chest, but directly at the hand that wore the ring. Lira twisted aside just in time. The blade grazed her wrist, slicing through the cloth and leaving a thin red line in the skin. Blood sprang out. The ring touched her blood and suddenly flared as though drinking it. The woman saw, and her eyes changed from cold calculation into something very close to greed. "It really is," she whispered, not to Lira, but to herself. Those words shattered Lira's spell of amazement at once. She spun, vaulted past the church soldier still kneeling in pain, kicked through the makeshift wooden door of an old coal shed, and fled through the back way despite the startled cries from inside. She ran across 2 backyards, jumped a low fence, tore the hem of her skirt on an exposed nail. Behind her, pursuit continued. though more chaotically now that their tracking light had gone out. Lira did not stop. Only when she finally squeezed into a slit of an alley so narrow a person must turn sideways to pass between the damp walls did she force herself to halt and hold her breath. The darkness there was thick with the smell of mold. Her heart struck hard and painful in her chest. Her wrist burned from the cut. Blood soaked into the grey strip of cloth. The ring was still hot, very hot, but not frightening, not to her. On the contrary, through all the panic and cold sweat, Lira became aware of something that horrified her more than the people chasing her. Some part of her was exhilarated, not because she was hurt, not because she had nearly been caught, but because in the instant when she snapped the church soldier's binding mark, she had felt herself grow taller, stronger, as though for the space of a single breath she had stood above all those hunting her. The sensation was beautiful in a way that felt shameful. It made her knees shake both with fear and with the hunger to touch it again. "What in God's name is happening to me?" she muttered. "At last," said a voice from the deeper darkness at the far end of the passage, low, male, and entirely unfamiliar. "You are asking the correct question," Lira whirled. A figure detached itself from the blackness, leaning loosely against the wall as though he had been standing there for some time. Not the man in black from the night before. This one was younger, with dark hair tied carelessly at the nape, wearing a long charcoal coat bearing no insignia, though its lines were cut with the same severe precision. His gaze flicked over her bleeding wrist and came to rest on the ring at once. "And you ought to keep running," he said calmly, "because if you remain standing there looking stunned, they will find you before I have decided whether I mean to save you or sell you." Lira had never in her life been forced to consider whether she ought to trust a stranger who had just calmly informed her that he might sell her, but then she had never in her life been hunted by two different factions at once because of a ring on her hand. So instead of wasting breath on further useless questions, she did the only reasonable thing left to her. She ran. The man did not even gesture for her to follow in any particular direction. He merely turned and slipped deeper into the narrow darkness, like water, finding a crack in stone. Lira gritted her teeth and ran after him, one hand clamped over the wrist, still leaking blood, the other grazing the wall to keep from slipping on the slick moss. The alley was so tight that her sleeves rasped against the brick, and then, after a sudden turn, it opened onto the rear yard of a row of abandoned warehouses. The man vaulted a broken rain trough and passed through a crooked wooden door as if he had known beforehand that it would not be locked. Lira kept close behind, her mind too far behind the moment to hold anything except the mad hammering of her heart in her ears. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had blurred, though they had not entirely vanished. She heard someone shout at the mouth of the lane, the clang of metal striking a wall, then footsteps breaking off in different directions. They were not certain which way she had turned, but if she lost even a few seconds more, they would sweep the place soon enough. Inside the warehouse it was almost pitch black. Only a thin silver blade of light fell through a hole in the roof onto rotting crates and mouldy sacks. The smell of old dust and rat scurry mingled with the damp reek of rain-soaked wood. The man crossed straight to the rear wall and pressed one shoulder against two boards stacked there. A gap appeared. "Through," he said. Lira did not ask why an abandoned warehouse possessed a hidden way through its wall. She ducked her head and squeezed through the opening, barely wide enough for a thin person. On the other side was a narrow corridor running between two thick, high walls, windowless and blind. Perhaps it had once been an old passage for moving goods and had since been forgotten. The man pulled the boards shut again behind them, and darkness swallowed everything in a single breath. Then he touched two fingers to the lamp hanging at his belt. A pale blue speck bloomed beneath the glass. It was enough to show his face more clearly. Young, truly young, likely no more than a few years past 20, hollow-cheeked, thin-lipped, dark-eyed, though those eyes caught the light like the surface of black water. He was the sort of person who did not need to smile to suggest something cutting, something nearer mockery than kindness. "Keep moving," he said. "You're bleeding too visibly." Lira glanced down at her wrist. The cut was not deep, but blood had soaked a dark line through the torn cloth. The ring sat in the middle of that red, black, and unnervingly calm, like an open eye. She was suddenly struck by the fear sharper than the pain. The woman had seen the ring touch her blood, and her whole expression had changed. "Who are they?" Lira asked, still walking after him. The short version or the true one? Whichever one helps me avoid dying before dawn. He glanced at her, perhaps for the first time seeing an answer worth granting a little respect. The grey coats with the cage belong to the Church of the Ashen Pillar. You've already seen that. The woman is less certain. She might be with the Black Glass Circle. She might belong to some collector of forbidden relics. She might simply be a scavenger who smelled something valuable and wanted to reach it before anyone else. Why are they chasing me? The man looked down at her hand. Because you're wearing something that ought not to have appeared in the lower city. That answer did nothing except lay another stone on her chest. Do you know what it is? He did not reply at once. The corridor ended at a low trapdoor. He crouched, lifted the latch, and pushed the wooden cover upward. Damp cold rose below, thick with the smell of stagnant water. I know enough not to get myself killed stupidly over it, he said. And enough to understand that you don't begin to grasp what you've walked into. He climbed down first, by means of a rusted iron ladder. Lira followed. Below lay an old sewer channel, not one of the main arteries, so the water only trickled in a black gutter to one side, while the stone walkway remained dry enough to cross. The ceiling was low, and even the smallest sound travelled very far. When Lira's boots touched the ground, he closed the trapdoor above them, and the whole place sank into the pale blue glow of the little lamp. "What's your name?" she asked, almost because she needed something ordinary to grip amid the disorder. "Neris," he said without turning. "Don't make the mistake of trusting me just because I gave you a real one." Lira stared for half a beat. Neris? A girl's name. Then she felt foolish for noticing something so trivial now. He moved quickly along the sewer path as if he knew every stone beneath his feet. Lira kept close, listening to the slap of water and feeling the chill, mold-laden air cling to her skin. Only when he seemed certain that no sounds of pursuit were filtering down from above did Neris slow. At a bend where the passage curved out of sight, he set the lamp on a stone ledge and turned fully toward her. "Give me your hand." "What?" "Your blood. It may help them trace you more easily, and I dislike traveling with a beacon." The way he said it made Lira instantly take half a step back, folding her wounded arm against herself. Neris gave a short laugh with no trace of amusement. "If I meant to take your ring now, I'd have done it when you were still standing stunned in that alley. Give me your hand." He drew a narrow-necked vial and a clean strip of cloth from his coat. Lira hesitated for several seconds. But her wrist was throbbing sharply, and the truth was that if he did mean to rob her, she was not certain she could stop him anyway. She held her hand out. Neris cut away the dirty cloth, examined the wound, and frowned. A good throw. He uncorked the vial and poured over the cut a clear liquid that smelled sharp and biting, like spirits mixed with mint. Lira hissed. "Pain is good," he said flatly. "It means you haven't lost all sensation because of the ring." That made her look up at once. "It can make me lose sensation. In time, you'll discover what it can make you lose." He wrapped the new cloth around her wrist with neat, efficient hands, every motion precise. His fingers were cold, but deft. And when his hand came near the ring, Lira noticed very clearly that Neris took care not to let his skin touch the metal itself. Not disgust. Caution. Once the knot was tied, he straightened and took up the lamp again. "Keep walking." To where? Somewhere nobody likes pursuing people into after midnight. Where is that? A place foul enough that the church dislikes stepping inside, and filthy enough that agents of the Black Glass Circle may hesitate to sacrifice their boots. Though the line sounded almost playful, nothing in his face was joking. Lira let out a slow breath. She ought to have been afraid of him. She still ought to be. But amid the succession of incomprehensible things crashing over her, the presence of someone who knew the paths, knew the names of the factions chasing her, knew how to carry antiseptic and bandage a wound properly, created something very nearly like order. A hard-edged, unpleasant order, but order all the same. "I don't know you," she said as they began walking again. "I don't require that you know me." "Then why are you helping me?" Neris was silent for several steps. The runnel of sewage murmured through the pause. At last he said, "Who told you I'm helping? You just dragged me away, bandaged my arm, hid me from them. Or perhaps I'm keeping the merchandise intact so I can sell it for more." The remark ought to have angered her, yet somehow, because he said it with such unadorned bluntness, she found it difficult to summon outrage. It sounded less like a threat than a naked fact, too stripped of pretense to make room for deceit. "You are a terrible sort of person," she muttered. "That's how I've managed to survive this long," Nerys replied. After several more turnings, the sewer began to slope upward. The air smelled marginally less foul. At last they stopped before a round iron door set into the stone wall. Nerys knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more. From the other side came the sound of bolts shifting, the scrape of a spy slot opening, and then a rough voice. "No strangers tonight." "Then admit me," Nerys answered, "and one very profitable complication." The slot closed, a chain of catches clicked open, the door swung inward to reveal a low-ceilinged chamber dimly lit by ghost lamps trapped in glass jars. An old man missing one ear sat behind a filthy table, turning over a deck of cards in his hand. He looked Lira over from head to toe, pausing a fraction too long at the fresh white bandage wrapped round her wrist. "What is it?" he asked Nerys. "A girl. Not that." "What's under the bandage?" Nerys gave a slight crooked smile. "If I told you I wasn't entirely certain, would you still let us in?" The old man studied him for another beat, then stepped aside. 2 hours, he said. "Don't break anything." Nerys nodded and drew Lira in. The door slammed shut behind them. The chamber turned out to be only a guardroom before another maze. Low corridors and small rooms carved deep beneath the old stone foundations of the city, where people had set up drinking tables, shipping chests, wooden bunks, even racks crowded with damp cloaks. It was not an inn, and not quite a warehouse either. It felt more like a hidden organ inside the city's body, a place where dealings not meant to see the light had come to nest. Some people sat at cards, some dozed on benches. A woman was sewing the hem of a coat for a scar-faced man. No one looked at Lira for more than a passing glance. In a place like this, strangers carrying trouble were far too common to be worth marveling at. Nerys led her into a small room at the far end of the passage. There was only a wooden table, 2 low chairs, and a basin of water. He set the lamp down, leaned against the wall, crossed his arms, and looked at her. "All right," he said. "Now start at the beginning." "Where did you get the ring?" Lira hesitated, but then she understood she had gone far too far to keep clutching the story, like a child hiding a marble in her pocket. So she told him. Not every shameful feeling that had gone with it, but enough of the important things: the dusk market, the old vendor, the strangely cheap price, the dream of the woman in the fire, the black thread on the customer's wrist, the music box, Toma, the lock and the mirror, the apprentice and the backlash, the man in black, then tonight's pursuit. As she spoke, Nerys listened with a face so little changed it was hard to guess what he was thinking. There was only one point at which he truly frowned, when Lira mentioned the ring touching her blood and flaring hot. "Good," he said. "Very good." "How is that good?" "Because now I'm almost certain." "Certain of what?" Nerys looked up. In the pale blue light his face seemed leaner, wearier, and sharper still. "That you didn't simply stumble onto an ordinary forbidden object." His gaze dropped to her hand. "You accidentally bought an artifact people believed lost a very long time ago." Lira sat rigid. "What is it called?" Nerys was silent for exactly 1 beat, as though weighing whether speaking the name aloud might open yet another door. "If I'm right," he said, "then what you're wearing is the ash ring." The name fell into the cramped room like a drop of molten metal. Lira repeated it silently in her mind, and at once the ring upon her finger grew warm, not fiercely, but unmistakably, like an animal turning its head when called by name. "The ash ring," she whispered. "What is it?" Nerys breathed out through his nose, half in irritation, half as though he resented being the one forced to explain. "An object tied to a witch." "Which witch? You dreamed of a woman standing in fire, didn't you?" Lira nodded. Nerys watched her for another moment, then said slowly, "Her name was Astavaya." The name made the empty space inside Lira's head seem to tremble very slightly. Asta, Vaya. It meant nothing to her, and yet it carried the sensation of something that had always been lying somewhere inside her memory, waiting only to be touched. Who was she? If you ask the church, they'll tell you she was one of the last truly wicked witches, a woman who laid curses across half the northern territories. If you ask collectors of forbidden relics, they'll tell you she knew how to reach the essence of curses rather than merely wield them. If you ask those who lost family in the purges, he shrugged, they will all tell you something different. Her death is more famous than her life, burned in Ryan, a very long time ago. The broken images from Lira's dream aligned into something cold along her spine. Then the ring. If it truly was hers, Nerys said, then you should be grateful you still possess both legs. She looked at him. Then why don't you take it? I've already told you. I prefer staying alive. But you know it's valuable. Valuable does not mean one ought to put one's hand into a wolf's mouth. He paused, only briefly. Besides, if it has already accepted you, touching it now may not be wise. Lira lowered her gaze to the ring once more. She ought to have felt horror. She knew that. An artifact, bound to a witch burned alive, important enough for the church to hunt with instruments in the night, important enough for strangers to pursue her and throw knives at her hand. And yet beneath the fear there rose again a kind of astonishment almost akin to pleasure, a sweet fever. She had been right. It was not nonsense, not a hallucination, not some cheap trinket bought on impulse. This was something with a name, a history, a thing that had once made people tremble, and it was on her hand. The thought was beautiful in a way that felt shameful. Nerys studied her expression and gave a dry little smile. Don't look like that. Like what? Like someone who's just discovered gold in a rubbish heap. Lira pressed her lips together. I'm not. You are, he interrupted, without malice, only with too much honesty. I can see it, and be honest, it must feel magnificent. The sentence struck exactly the place she had not yet dared to name. Lira turned her face away. She faltered, then for some reason told the truth, perhaps because he had already seen too much for her to maintain the useless pose of innocence. When I use it, I feel as though for the first time in my life I can actually do something. Not only watch, not beg, not wait for someone to save me. She closed her hand slightly. I know that sounds awful, but yes, I did like the feeling. Nerys was silent for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had softened by so slight a degree it was almost imperceptible. It doesn't sound awful at all, only dangerous. The little room fell quiet. Outside, somewhere in the underground maze, came a brief laugh, the thud of a cup against wood, and farther still the murmuring run of sewer water. Lira drew a long, slow breath. Things had gone too far to be turned back within a single night. The ring was still on her hand. The church had already seen its sign. At least one other faction was hunting it as well. And the only person who could explain any of this to her even half clearly was a man who openly admitted he might sell her if the price proved right. All of that ought to have driven her to despair. Yet instead she found herself sitting straighter in her chair, eyes fixed upon the ring beneath the white bandage. Because beneath all the chaos there remained one fact that nothing could erase. She had tasted power, and she could no longer pretend it had never touched her. Nerys pushed himself away from the wall and stepped to the table. In 2 hours this place won't be safe either, he said. If they start combing through here tonight, that iron door out there won't hold them for long. Then what am I supposed to do? He looked at her, then at the ring. If you want to stay alive, he said, then from this moment on, you no longer have the right to be alone. This story has more parts coming up, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to catch the next episodes. Thank you so much for staying and listening until the end of the video. If you enjoy the story as well as the cute little knitted items, please don't forget to like and share the channel.